Hello, and welcome to the EcoSend Podcast, a weekly podcast on becoming a climate-conscious business. Every week, we'll be interviewing founders, marketers, and leaders who are championing the climate. The podcast is hosted by myself, James Gill, co-founder and CEO of Go Squared, and the makers of EcoSend. If you run a business or are responsible for growing one, and you want to have a positive impact on the environment, then listen on. Every episode, our goal is for you to learn something and be inspired to take some action. Every single one of us making small changes and some large changes will add up. We're all in this together. So let's get on with the show. Thanks so much for listening. Now let's meet today's guest. Hi there, welcome to another episode of the EcoSend Podcast. I'm your host, James Gill, and I'm thrilled to be introducing you to another wonderful guest today. I have the pleasure of speaking to many entrepreneurs, leaders, people in the charitable sector, and today my guest spans several of those. My guest today is Raoul, and he runs a business called Tyve, which is a free-to-use payroll giving platform that makes it simple for employees to donate to charity from their pre-tax earnings. Before joining Tyve at the beginning of 2023, Raoul was an executive at fast-growing tech companies, including Eve Sleep and iwoca, where he led the product management teams. Now, Raoul, you're covering a lot of bases here, which I'm very excited to talk to you about, from the business sector to charitable giving to how to be an effective charitable giver and all of these topics. I can't wait to dive in. So good to be speaking with you. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm excellent. Thanks for having me on the podcast, James.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So Raoul, tell me more about yourself. What are you up to? What is Tyve? I'd love to hear it in your own words. Take it from the top, and I'm sure our listeners are very keen to hear too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tyve is like you said, it's a way to donate to charity from pre-tax earnings through your company's payroll. What we're trying to do, what our mission is to get more people donating even small amounts regularly to charity in a really thoughtful way. So less of a reactive way of just giving when someone asks you or someone stops you on the street, but giving to charities which really match the kind of values that you hold as a person. So we really want to normalize giving just for like every person, so that's not really thinking about giving more deeply isn't just something that is left to, kind of millionaires and billionaires. So the way we do it is by donating through your payroll, which means it can go pre-tax. But we also try to simplify the experience. So there have been payroll giving tools out there, platforms out there for quite a long time. We try to really improve it, give a really modern UX. So myself and the founders of Tyve all come from tech backgrounds, and we want to make this feel kind of like intuitive and something like a consumer app that you would want to use. We add great customer service into that. We also add a couple of other ways to really make giving simpler for people. So one is doing charity recommendations. So we kind of like have 6 recommended charities within different cause areas. So we have one within tackling climate change, one within saving lives, one within creating economic opportunity. And we use third-party research from organizations like GiveWell and Founders Pledge and Animal Charity Evaluators to narrow down on the most effective charities within each of those causes. So the ones where for each pound, you're probably going to get like the highest impact. I think there's been really exciting work done by those organizations in the last 10 years to really kind of like narrow down an impact in a way that didn't really exist with charities before that. So this is kind of like a really like capitalizing a little bit on some of this kind of some of this recent trend on the research side. So we're really excited to kind of like be able to recommend those charities, and for people who like yourself maybe are really believe in like tackling climate change but aren't sure about out of those like many different places you could put your money, which are the most effective. This I think really helps. And then the third bit of like simplifying it or maybe making it more motivating and rewarding, this part of it is giving kind of reports back to the people who are donating and the companies as a whole, so they can kind of see their impact. And again, because the research allows us to quantify, for each pound spent, how many tons of carbon dioxide would you expect to be averted, or in the case of like in the case of saving lives, how many people you might protect against malaria, which is kind of like our chosen charity kind of works in that area. So you can see kind of over the course of a month, but then also a year and across the years, like the impact that you're having, the cumulative impact, and the way that kind of even relatively small donations really make a difference over time.
Awesome. That is such a good summary. And I must admit, like, obviously for us, as soon as you got in touch about this role, I was so excited to try it out. And everything you said there about it being simpler and easier to sort of just get started, about the transparency, about the education around and then the help in finding what a good place is to donate. All of those things are absolutely the case. And it, as a team at EcoSend, I think we just all were immediately like, this sounds exactly like the sort of thing we should be doing. How have we not been doing this before? So yeah, I am a big fan on my end, and it is so easy to just get started. So yeah, no, that's such a great summary. I am actually really keen to dig into that a lot more, and the detailed aspects of how Tyve works and what the goals are ultimately of Tyve. But I guess before we dive into that, it'd be great to hear how you got to this point, Raoul. Because, did you just wake up one day and think, I'm gonna go and do payroll giving and make it easier for people? I doubt that happened. So how did you get there?
There's a little bit of that. Look, I think with all of us, right, we have values that we hold often for a long time, and sometimes we put more of our time and effort into kind of like upholding them, and sometimes we have a lot of other things on our mind, right? So there's always this trade-off throughout our lives. And I started my career working in investments in Australia and then in the UK. And at the time I was working mostly in the utility sector, which was mostly what you'd call dirty energy, right? So in Australia, it was like heavily coal-fired power plants, a little bit of natural gas, but there was the kind of like move towards clean energy, and it started being like probably the exciting investment opportunities within that sector. So anyone kind of, I was working with, like, that was the area we were really like looking at, like with as having a huge amount of potential for the future. But also I think, for a lot of people, again, like early 20s, like it's like the excitement of doing something that might have a positive impact for the world. So I spent a few years doing that. Moving over to the UK, I was working for a clean tech investor here. But then kind of like I left that world behind a little bit. I went to business school, started working in growth stage tech companies, quite different businesses. But I kind of like always had this interest in, sustainability and clean energy investing, or just thinking about like what solutions are out there to really help with tackling climate change. So, again, I think it comes down to like you've got these values, they stay with you. And then I think often for people, in their careers, they see an opportunity to do something that, is both maybe something that feels like the right thing to do at that point in their career, but also something that really kind of like aligns really strongly with their values. And last year, I had that opportunity when I met one of the founders of Tyve, who was looking for someone to take it on and take it over and kind of like, drive a second stage of growth for the business. We operate as a non-profit. So it's kind of like, and Tyve, we operate as a non-profit. So we, kind of like try to operate like really lean. But we're a small team, and we have the excitement of kind of like that very early stage of a startup. So, kind of having this opportunity to work at this point in my career on something that's kind of like a startup, but also doing potential to do something like really great in the world, just seemed like an obvious thing to go for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't I wonder how different it is actually considering yourself a non-profit versus the average startup, which you don't hear the word profit banded around very often in any startup, do you really?
No, I mean it's a great question. I guess the motive becomes a little bit different, right? So for us, the longer term goal is very much focused on the impact rather than kind of like, getting that huge exit, getting to profitability, and then getting that huge exit, which I think a lot of people are looking for with a startup. So I think the day to day feels pretty similar, right? Like kind of the we're thinking about growth, right? We're thinking about how do
Yeah.
we manage our operations. We're thinking about product market fit a lot of the time, right? Like how do we improve the product that we have so that it kind of attracts more people? I mean, that's obviously the key to growth. So we take the feedback and we iterate quickly, just like we would at a startup. So I think bringing that startup experience and that startup mentality to a nonprofit is hugely valuable. I guess it's just like kind of what we're chasing in the long term is slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really, really good way of putting it. And I from what I understand, you've got some amazing background in the I guess the for-profit sector, or the businesses not doing entirely or purely altruistic things, which is bringing some incredible
Yeah.
expertise to the table on the profit side, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd call it the commercial sector,
The
right? So at
commercial,
least the
yeah.
goal is profitability. Yeah, it's not always there, like you say, especially in the early stages of business. But that's definitely the goal. Yeah, I think bringing that expertise over is really helpful. But I think it's also just about like kind of like the the approach to the work, the discipline of like running experiments and making sure that you're getting the kind of like you're able to get data and read results and learn from that quickly, which you would never in a commercial business, you'd never really be able to work in any other way. I think, with nonprofits, there's various ways people work, and ours is just kind of like, our approach is just to do it by learning kind of probably the better aspects from the commercial world, with, well, hopefully not bringing some of the maybe less great aspects with us.
Yeah, yeah. Only the good stuff. Only the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That's yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. I feel like there's I feel like there's so many tangents we could go on here on this discussion, but like the opportunity for more people with this extremely um valuable skill set coming into the world of nonprofits and purpose driven businesses, um just and having that kind of mindset, but towards other goals that are not purely about growth of revenue and growth of profit exclusively. I think it's just exciting seeing that take shape and how that could transform charity and charitable giving, and just overall making the world a better place, which is yeah, I just find that so uplifting, positive, exciting. Yeah, it's cool. It's in terms of Tyve itself then, um like you've got a quite a clear mission with Tyve, I believe, which would be just great to hear more about in your own words, because yeah, it's guiding everything you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, it's really about kind of just normalizing charitable giving.
Right.
So making it something that, just feels like something you do, right? Something everyone
Mm,
thinks about at least a little bit of the time, right? It's never going to
yeah.
be necessarily, for a lot of people, it's never going to be like the thing they spend a huge amount of time on. Everyone has a lot of things in their lives, right? You get really busy with your lives, especially as you kind of like get into your like 20s, and you do start having a job and you do start having the money maybe to start supporting charities. But you also get a lot of other responsibilities at that point in time. So charitable giving, or just more broadly, like thinking about the problems in the world and thinking about how to solve them, often kind of takes a little bit of a
Mm.
backseat.
Yeah, you've
We
got
just want
your
to get
own
it back.
problems to solve, let alone the rest of the world. So
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly, exactly. So just kind of like getting it back on people's radar a little bit, so they think about it, every month, like there are things that I can do to help, maybe people who are less well off than myself, or like, help the world, in terms of like things like climate change, like big problems that are going on out there. I think just kind of like I would love to see, a scenario where of the people, especially as they go into the workplace, right? There's hundreds of thousands of people going into the workplace every year. It just becomes part of their like, kind of things they think about as like part of their work, kind of part of their working life is, okay, I've got this paycheck, I've got some benefits as well, maybe every month, but like, what am I doing to give back as well? And how do I do that? What are the choices I make? And then hopefully that's something that continues throughout people's careers.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great. It's just so easy to try and get behind that. I guess maybe a question I'd have is that are you finding that tougher in today's like climate economy where we only need to listen to the news on any given day of how everyone's finding it tougher, prices for whatever it is, houses, food, rent is through the roof. Like, are you finding it tougher to persuade people of that cause, or has that not changed for the businesses you talk to? Or I'm intrigued, has that changed at all?
Yeah, I definitely think for a lot of people, things are tougher than they were maybe pre-COVID, maybe go back to like 2019. I mean, it's been a rough few years for a lot of people,
Yeah,
both from an economic perspective, but also, a health perspective or a mental health perspective going through the pandemic.
yeah.
And so asking people then to, support charities which maybe are doing work, kind of often in, kind of to try to solve problems that are maybe either quite remote in, kind of time and place, or, also a bit more abstract, like how do we really solve like a giant problem like climate change? I do think it sometimes feels like it can be a big ask for people. I think again, it goes back to encouraging people, even if you start at a relatively small amount, an amount that you can afford. I think the companies we're dealing with, the people who are working there, a lot of them feel like they can afford, at least something every month. So we
Yeah,
get kind of the last three companies we've launched, we've had more than 40% of employees at those companies choosing to donate each month through Tyve, which I think is incredible. And it shows the generosity of a lot of people when you really talk to them about the problems and when they get a little bit of time to kind of think about it. And they have a simple way to like execute on these kind of like good intentions that they have. Would it be a bit different? Like maybe could it be even higher in like a booming economic time? I think so, a little bit. I think it would also be easier to get companies to kind of like sign up for Tyve at the moment. Some companies are a bit hesitant for reasons I can understand. They're not, some companies aren't doing that well themselves, and they feel like this isn't the right time to kind of launch something where they're asking their employees to give. Maybe they're matching donations, maybe they're not, but they're really kind of like asking their employees to do something for the collective good. And, hopefully that's going to change in the next few years. Hopefully we get back to kind of an economic situation where more people feel comfortable, more people feel a bit more secure. But even right now, I think there is a huge amount of generosity in the human spirit in general, and in a lot of the people that we go out and talk to. So it hasn't really. I don't think it's really dampened it as much as you might think.
Yeah, that's absolutely, fascinating actually, because in some ways, I don't know, I don't have data to back this up, but just a general sense I find is that post pandemic, there's this sort of sense that no matter who you are, no matter what income you're on, what job you do, where you are in the world, like everyone was affected by COVID in some way, and that's quite eye-opening. I think it shows that actually some of these charitable causes that one could give to, they're relevant for everyone. It's not, that could come back to help me someday. And I would like to think that if there's anything good that came from COVID, there's maybe a greater appreciation that we're still humans, we're still people walking around on this rock floating in the universe. We're not above, no matter what job you do or who you are, like you're not above certain things, and that need to connect with our fellow well, not even just humans, but with the world and the planet we're on is worth bearing in mind. And does that lead more people to just make some decisions that are not so totally self interested going forward. Maybe it does. I don't know.
I definitely think there's. I think there's something true in that. You definitely get a number of people who just feel really fortunate to have got through kind of COVID, and they feel fortunate. Sometimes they feel fortunate when they're in a position, like in a difficult economic environment, when they're in a position where they're still earning well, or their company's doing well, and they feel like, okay, maybe in this scenario I should be doing more to help other people who need it a bit more. So I think maybe an element of, the last few years have just made some people just appreciate how lucky a lot of us are, the ones who are fortunate enough to still be feeling relatively economically secure.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very good point indeed. In terms of charity and it being relevant and actually mattering in the grander scheme of things today, like obviously going back to one of your earlier points, like people have a lot on their plates, their own, what, like, and yeah, given times are tougher, well, why does charity matter as much as you, or does charity matter as much as you like us all to think it does at the moment? Like, is charity the best place to be putting our money? I'm keen to get your thoughts on that, Raoul. What are your thoughts?
It's a great question. I think I don't know if there's a best place for people to put their money, right? Like everyone has different needs and different financial circumstances, and for some people it's just they have things that they have to do right now with their money, and that, again, it's really an individual choice. I think the role charity plays is still a very important one, and I think over the past a couple of decades, there's been a rise in something kind of like in an adjacent area, which is like social entrepreneurship, where you have a business that's trying to do good, has impact as like one of its core goals, but is also often selling a service or charging for a service or a product. And the whole model is based on something that kind of like marries kind of commercial objectives and impact objectives.
Yeah,
I think that's really awesome. Like a lot of these businesses are really great businesses, and they are doing a lot of good. And I think from a business model perspective, it's actually, if you can manage that as a business model, it's amazing, right? Because you're kind of like much more likely to be long-term self-sustaining doing that.
Sure.
But I think there's still a big role for charity to play in areas where there are kind of market failures, right? Where there's not necessarily a product that anyone is going to, product or a service that anyone is going to pay for. Mm-hmm. And so you get obvious areas like climate change, right? Whether you've got kind of like a tragedy of the commons where everyone can, or historically has been able to, destroy the climate as much as they want. For whatever reasons, but often for with commercial goals in mind, and no one is willing to pay to fix it, right? So, and there's obviously lots of different mechanisms to try to resolve that today. But there's also there's a role also for some charities which are working in the climate change area. And the one that we kind of recommend is the Clean Air Task Force, which kind of looks at driving systemic change through global agreements and regulation, kind of being the driving force behind some of these agreements and domestic and regional legislation, but also like kind of like advocating for neglected technologies which don't necessarily at a very early stage have like really strong market demand for them.
Yeah.
So you've got this kind of like market failure in the area of climate change, but you also have market failures like on a smaller level where I mentioned, the one we think about in terms of saving lives is we recommend the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes anti-malarial bed nets primarily or actually exclusively in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the area of the world most affected by malaria, where we still get 400,000 people, upwards of 400,000 people a year dying from malaria.
Wow.
And there's not necessarily a natural market for this product, partly because it's very hard for the consumers to understand, right? You have, there's like great economics research on this. There's great papers on, kind of like, published in top journals on kind of explaining the cost effectiveness of this, but that's not necessarily like common knowledge. It's not necessarily that easy to understand. And if you have a market only for a small number of these things, the distribution costs get really high. Whereas if you do this on a charitable basis, at extreme scale, the Against Malaria Foundation, GiveWell estimates it costs slightly under £5 to protect 2 people against malaria. So again, there's kind of like a market failure here where, the true value of this is not necessarily going to result in the product being available for purchase at a price that might generate a lot of demand.
Yeah. I think you've convinced me that charity does matter somewhat. Not that I needed much convincing, but yeah, totally. And you've obviously mentioned a few there, but I'm sure there's a list, a very, very, very long list of those areas where pure play business cannot accommodate the needs we have in the world. I guess very much related to what we talk about at EcoSend, like how can charity, and particularly charitable giving, then how does that have an impact on climate change, or how can it? And you mentioned the Clean Air Task Force there. I assume that's a big part of it. I'm increasingly aware of their work, but yeah, are there other areas where charitable giving can have a big impact here, Raoul?
Yeah, I think there are several. I think there's an organization called Giving Green, which kind of does evaluations of climate change specific charities, which I think is really worth checking out for people. I think where charity comes into this, so I think if you look at what EcoSend is doing right now, where it's like planting a tree for every new user, but also on a monthly basis based on a certain number of emails sent, right?
Yeah.
So if I send enough
absolutely.
emails, which is awesome. I don't send enough. I use EcoSend, but I don't send enough emails to plant that many trees. But I imagine a lot of big business as well, and that's awesome, right? And planting trees is like a great example of like the types of things that on an individual basis we can get through using a product like EcoSend, or maybe ourselves by using something like Tree App and kind of financing it ourselves. But planting trees is only a part of what's going to really help with kind of mitigating climate change. So I think I was reading research that suggests that to look at having a really substantial impact and getting us towards a 1.5 degree rise in temperature from pre-industrial times, which is kind of like the goal that most people see as kind of like a safe increase in temperature. We need to plant something a lot in the order of 500 billion trees, right? That's a lot of trees, right? That's a lot of trees, even if you divided that by like the 7 billion people on Earth, right?
And even if all of them start using EcoSend, that's still not going to have the impact we need. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure I want to live in a world where you send so many emails that we plant half a.
Well, exactly. That could all come crashing down, couldn't it? Yeah.
I'd be getting a lot of email. So there's a sense of like, okay, like there's all these pieces of the puzzle, right? Like for tackling climate change, and some of them can be like a little bit like some of them maybe can be purely market based, right? Like you see the decline in the price of renewable energy, right? To the point where in a lot of countries now it's competitive or better with fossil fuels. So if you're developing a new power generation project, you're going to go for renewables if there's a good resource in the area. And that's incredible, right? That is probably like one of the biggest advances over the last kind of 20 years, is just making these like attractive on a commercial basis. But I think there's a lot of other areas, like we say, where there's maybe market failures in place, where there's not necessarily going to be a purely commercial incentive for anyone to do anything. And I think things like global agreements and regulation and neglected technologies are some of those areas, and in those areas, that require some sort of financing for people to address them. I think that's like a really good investment through or any charitable pound or dollar that we spend. So I think it's, again, I don't think it's necessarily, charity is not going to solve all of this problem with tackling climate change. I think the market needs to solve a lot, if not most of it. But I think, charitable giving has like a role to play in specific areas, and some areas that like actually are pretty crucial to getting the overall framework in place that then the markets can operate to really get great solutions.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great to hear. So yeah, hopefully we'll be making a lot of progress on all fronts over the coming, well, not even years, the rest of this year. We've still got a whole half a year to go. There's a lot of progress to come. I mean, was there anything else around the future on either on charitable giving or around climate change that you had any views on then, Raoul? Like, I mean, not that I'm asking you to predict or promise what's going to happen, but what are your thoughts on where things go, maybe beyond this year and over the course of the next several years, like maybe decade or so? Like, that's a long time, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to know, right? Especially, I feel like for a lot of people, and I include myself in that, like, I think the confidence with which we look to the future has probably declined in the last year because of the rapid increase in the performance of artificial intelligence, right? So it's very, very hard to know what that's going to look like in a year's time, let alone 10 years' time, and how that's going to contribute to solving some of these kind of global problems that we've talked about. I think it's probably easy to take a relatively, look, it's easy to take a pessimistic view, but it's also easy to take a relatively optimistic view on that, right? That increases in artificial intelligence might really help us with developing very cheap technologies that help us mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. I think one area, again, that's maybe a little bit overlooked, where charitable giving can make a huge difference, is thinking about, the parts of the world that are going to need to adapt to some level of climate change, no matter what we do on the mitigation front, right? So if we see even 1.5 degree temperature rises, there's going to be parts of the world, especially the driest parts of the world and some of the wettest parts of the world, which are still going to suffer more extreme weather events. And a lot of these parts of the world are actually some of the most impoverished parts of the world, where we have the most people living beyond kind of living in extreme poverty. Yeah. And thinking about how do we help those people adapt. They're not necessarily always in places with either, with governments that are in place to help them as much as they might want to, or with governments that are necessarily as stable as a lot of people would like them to be. So I think, I think a lot of the time we focus on like, what can we do to reduce climate change in future? But I think, whatever we do, there's going to be like a big role in thinking about how do we help the people who do suffer the consequences of it adapt. I mean, I'm sitting here in London at the end of June after, kind of 3 weeks of beautiful sunny weather, and it can feel like sometimes like a blessing in some parts of the world that we're able to, kind of like the impact of climate change is maybe even like, pleasant summers, and it doesn't. But if you go to places where it's already 40 degrees or 42 degrees, and you add a couple of degrees there, or you add like a longer spell of heat in those areas, it makes it really tough. So think about, what we do. One of the specific recommendations we have through Tyve is Give Directly, which is unconditional cash transfers, where you basically are transferring money to people living in extreme poverty, and often helping them double their income for just like, £1 a day. It often will be able to double people's income, which makes a huge difference to their lives in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And Give Directly's focus on both the poorest place in the world, but also they've now moved into doing a bit more disaster relief. So when there's like large natural disasters, giving people cash with no strings attached is often one of the best things you can do, because you let them decide what they need the most in those circumstances.
Right. Wow.
I think charities like that, where you're basically able to help people adapt without necessarily what Give Directly does, it doesn't impose any conditions, and it doesn't tell them what they need to solve the problem, but it just enables them to go to have a better chance of solving that problem themselves. I think we're going to play a pretty big role in the next 20, 30 years.
Wow. Yeah. I hope that I hope we also steer on the optimistic side of those predictions too, Raoul. I agree. It's never easy it's never easy even to just pontificate over the future, let alone put down some thoughts on it and actually clarify those enough to convey them to an audience. So thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear your take there, and also the various causes and businesses you've mentioned. We'll make sure those are all linked to in the notes for the episode if anyone wants to check them out. So well, this episode has flown by, and I don't want to finish without just asking. We always like to get some advice from people, or we like to hear any advice people have been given, and I believe you've got some very, very valuable advice for us. So not that you haven't given any advice already. I shouldn't discount everything you've already said, but yeah, anything you've heard or received as advice that you'd like to share with the audience, it'd be great to hear.
I mean, I guess I'm not sure it's advice so much as just like
it can be a joke if you want, but
I don't know if I'm in a great place to give advice. But I would say, if you have a few hours, I think it's worth for anyone who wants to think about the world's problems a little bit more deeply, picking up a copy of Peter Singer's The Life You Can Save. So Peter Singer's an Australian philosopher. He's possibly one of the more famous, maybe most famous living philosophers. That's not really saying that much, but he's kind of like built a career on I guess challenging people's preconceptions about various problems in the world, including how we tackle problems like poverty, how we think about treating animals more humanely. And The Life You Can Save is really focused on, kind of the question of what is our duty to help solve the world's most pressing problems. And it's a book that's, I think, had a profound effect on a lot of people who've read it, including myself. And I think, it results in a lot of people wondering whether they could live on 90% of their income they have now, or maybe even 99%, and seeing what they can do with the other 1% or 10% to really help improve the world. And yeah, it's a great book. It's really accessible as well. It's written in a way that you don't need to be an academic in any way, shape, or form to really get a lot from it. It's available for free online, which I think is awesome. I think we should stick that in the show notes as well. And there's actually a really great audio book version where there's like different people reading different chapters, like Stephen Fry, Kristen Bell, and stuff. So it's it's good. It's a good read, and I think it's one of those things where there's definitely a decent chance it'll make a fair impression on anyone who picks it up.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I have not read that myself yet. So that's now well and truly on the reading list. So thank you. You made it hard to say no to that, to be honest.
How long's your reading list? Is it very long?
But the order can change, so it doesn't really matter how long it is. It just depends what's at the top, doesn't it? No, thank you so much. Well, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. If anyone wants to find you and carry on any of the conversation, hear more from you, or wants to sign up to Tyve, where can they go?
They can email me directly. I'm Raoul@tyve.org. Or they can find me on LinkedIn, and just add me and DM me. I'd love to chat. Whether it's signing up for Tyve or really about anything that we've talked about. I'd love to hear from people.
Amazing. And it's Tyve, tyve.org, isn't it? For Tyve to go get your business on board there. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Raoul. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely fascinating to hear your thoughts on the charitable sector, on payroll giving, on how businesses can do better, and a great book recommendation too. So thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you everyone for listening. And if you've enjoyed today's show, please do leave us a review and let us know what you think. Give it a 5 stars, give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people hear about the show and hear wonderful stories like those from Raoul today. So thank you, Raoul. We'll catch you soon.
Thanks, James. It's been a pleasure.